Good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Church on, I guess, what is known as the Sleepy Sunday. But we're trying hard. This is a house of friendship, a haven in times of trouble, an open room for the encouragement of our struggle. So welcome this morning into this house of freedom, guarding the worth and dignity of all people. A house that believes that love is a human right. This house is a cradle for our dreams, the workshop for our common endeavors. Symbol of light and of knowledge, symbol of warmth and freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love. May we open our service, turning our hymn books, please, to number 208.
Today around the world, people are observing International Women's Day. But woohoo, right? Yeah. But it has a little bitter note to it here in the United States, especially if you cast your vote for a woman to be our president in this past month. It is hard, no matter whom you voted for, to realize that yet again, the country said it was willing to accept a woman as president, yet failed to support one. And no matter which candidate you supported, it still hurts that at this point in the primary, no female candidates remain viable. It still hurts that the United States ranks 75th in the world for women leaders in government. Old wounds have been reopened during this primary, and the hurt that you are feeling is real. But I don't hang out long in the depths of despair, and I hope you don't either. I'm choosing to celebrate this day by thinking about the women who made it possible for me to stand where I'm standing this morning. I'm thinking with gratitude about Universalist minister, the Reverend Olympia Brown, the first woman ordained in the United States with the consent of her denomination, and her mentor, the Reverend Antoinette Brown, the first woman ordained at all in the U.S. I'm thinking of Julia Ward Howe, she of Battle Hymn fame, who organized the Women's Ministerial Conference in 1875. I'm thinking of the women of the Iowa Sisterhood, Unitarian ministers who founded churches in the pioneer Midwest where male ministers thought a call would be beneath them. I'm thinking of my own predecessor in this pulpit, the Reverend Mila Tupper Maynard, who served this congregation 1897 to 1899. I'm thinking of the first woman president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, and the first elected president of the UUA, the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, who was elected from among 3 women candidates. I'm thinking too, gratefully, of all the male ministers who refused to entertain a run against these women because they agreed it was past time our faith was led by a woman. Now it's your turn. Think about the women who made it possible for you to do what you do. I'm not just talking about your mom or your grandma, your teachers, though I wish to cast no shade on the fine art of child rearing. I'm talking about your women mentors, your women bosses, your women leaders. If you can't think of a single woman who has led you in your lifetime, send your positive vibes to all the women all around the world who are in leadership right now, women who are still rising despite low pay and impossible standards and uncrackable glass ceilings. I invite you into a moment of silent appreciation for these women, for those you know only by name, and those you've never met. Send them hope and courage. Goddess of victory, open the gates for these women. Break the glass for these women. Pave the way for these women. Teach us to recognize their brilliance and lift them up. Amen.
Some of you may know Kent Harif. He's a great writer, died a couple of years ago, probably never made the A-list in terms of great writers, great American writers, but he certainly deserves to be there. He wrote a trilogy. The last of the books, called Benediction, is the source from which I want to draw the reading this morning. The trilogy takes place on the plains in eastern Colorado, and as you can well imagine, of course, this town of Holt, Colorado, has a church, and its minister's name is Lyle, and that's probably all you need to know for now to get you going into this little excerpt. It wasn't clear what Lyle expected the sermon to accomplish, but he wasn't even half finished when some of the congregation, men mostly, hurrying their wives and children with them, but some women too, began to rise up from their pews and glare at him and walk out of the church. It began simply enough. He gave the reading. He took up the Bible and stood out at a little distance from the pulpit. He didn't often do that, but he had done it once or twice before, so people were not immediately bothered or surprised by it. So he began to read to them without benefit of the barrier of the pulpit between him and them. Just his reading and the Bible. The text was from Luke. But I tell you who hear me, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you. If anyone hits you on one cheek, let him hit the other one too. If someone takes your coat, let him have your shirt as well. If you love only the people who love you, why should you receive a blessing? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good only to those who do good to you, why should you receive a blessing? He went on reading and came to the end of the text. Love your enemies and do good to them. Lend and expect nothing back. You will then have a great reward, and you will be sons of the Most High. Then he stopped and stood quietly and looked out at the congregation. The sanctuary was hot. The windows were open, but it was a hot day and hot inside. Women fanned at their faces with the church bulletin. A car drove by in the street. There was bird song from a nearby tree. He turned and set the Bible on the pulpit, and then he began to talk. This passage, he said, is usually referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. Augustine first called it that. It appears in the Gospels of both Matthew and Luke. The Bible texts say essentially the same thing. That these are the ones I've read just now, the crux of the matter for us, the soul of our lesson, and the very essence of the teaching of Jesus. Love your enemies, pray for those who harm you, turn the other cheek, give away money, and don't expect it back. What is Jesus talking about? He can't mean this literally. I mean, that would be impossible. He must have been speaking of some utopian idea, a fantasy. He must be using a metaphor, suggesting a sweet dream. Because all of us here today know better. We're awake to reality and know the world won't permit such a thing. It never has and never will. We can be clear about that right now. Because here we are at war again. And we know the inescapable images of war and violence so well. We've seen them all too often. The naked young girl running in terror towards us, crying and screaming away from fires behind her. The boy in the hospital room with his little brother and their frightened mother. He's been blinded. His face is scarred. "Am I ugly now, Mother?" he says. We see the pictures of the headless body dumped out beside the road in a ditch. We've seen the soldier, the black, stiff, grotesque thing that once was a man, burned now and hanged, dragged through the streets behind a truck. We've watched in horror the human figures leaping out of the windows of the burning tower. So we know the satisfaction of hate. We know the sweet joy of revenge, how it feels good to get even. Oh, that was a nice idea Jesus had. That was a pretty notion. But you can't love people who do evil. It's neither sensible nor practical. It's not wise to the world to love people who do such terrible wrong. There's no way on earth we can love our enemies. They'll only do wickedness and hatefulness again. And worse, they'll think they can get away with all this wickedness and evil because they'll think we're weak and afraid. What would the world come to? But I want to say to you, here on this hot July morning in Holt, what if Jesus wasn't kidding? What if he wasn't talking about some never, never land? What if he really did mean what he said 2,000 years ago? What if he was thoroughly wise to the world and knew firsthand cruelty and wickedness and evil and hate? Knew it all so well from firsthand personal experience. And what if, in spite of all he knew, he still said, "Love your enemies, turn your cheek, pray for those who misuse you"? What if he meant every word of what he said? What then would the world come to? And what if we tried it? What if we said to our enemies, "We are the most powerful nation on earth. We can destroy you. We can kill your children. We can make ruins of your cities and villages, and when we're finished, you won't even know how to look for the places where they used to be. We have the power to take away your water and to scorch your earth, to rob you of the very fundamentals of life. We can change the actual day into actual night. We can do all these things to you and more." But what if we say, "Listen, instead of any of these, we're going to give willingly and generously to you. We're going to spend the great American national treasure and the will and the human lives that we would have spent on destruction, and instead we're going to turn them all towards creation. We will mend your roads and highways, expand your schools, modernize your wells and water supplies, save your ancient artifacts and art and culture, preserve your temples and mosques. In fact, we are going to love you." And again we say, no matter what has gone before, no matter what you've done, we are going to love you. We have set our hearts to it. We will treat you like brothers and sisters. We're going to turn our collective national cheek and present it to be stricken a second time if need be, and offer it to you. I mean, listen, but then he was abruptly halted. Someone out in the congregation was talking. Are you crazy? You must be insane. A man's voice, deep-throated, angry, loud, coming from over on the west side of the sanctuary near the windows. What's wrong with you? You out of your mind? He stood up, a tall man in a light summer suit, staring at Lyle. You must be about as crazy as hell. He turned fiercely and grabbed his wife's hand, pulling her to her feet and gesturing angrily at their little boy. They came out of the pew and went hurrying back up the aisle, through the doors and out of the church. The congregation all watched them leave. Then they began to look around at one another. They looked again at Lyle. Well, what do the rest of you think? Lyle said. What do you say? He was standing next to the pulpit now. I'm not afraid to say, a man said. You're a damn terrorist sympathizer. He rose up in the middle of the sanctuary, holding on to the pew back ahead of him. Big, heavy-set man. We never should have let you come here. You are an enemy to our country. those chalice singers. They're so good. Every time, knock it out of the park. First, a special welcome to those who are new here for the first time or relatively new. Glad to have you with us. And this first announcement may pertain to you, but to everybody else who is just, kind of new, and that is this afternoon at 12:30, Reverend Monica will be holding a meeting up in the Haven. If you're new, just ask anybody where the Haven is. We don't offer heaven, but we do have a haven here. And it's going to be a chance to ask her all sorts of questions that have been going on through your mind. Wonderful chance to get to know her, a little bit about Unitarianism, Universalism, and so on and so forth. Which reminds me that on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, the 10th, Monica and I will together hold a UU orientation class right in that social hall, Elliott Hall, at 7 o'clock. And that always is a lot of fun. It is especially designed for newish people. Please come if you've got some interest in learning more about Unitarian Universalist history, theology, and maybe a little bit more about this church. Also, then on Friday, we've got the Spring Equinox Potluck. It's intergenerational. Just come, bring a dish, and have a lot of fun. Next Sunday, Celebration Sunday, the kickoff to our pledge drive. What a program featuring a very special guest from the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee in Cambridge. The Reverend Kathleen McTeague will be our featured speaker. Monica, I, the choir, everybody's going to be here, and I hope you will be here as well. And finally, please just note, March 26th, there will be a movie called Taxation Without Representation, and what makes that so special is that movie was produced by and exclusively members of our congregation. It's a movie about some of the failings of the Utah legislature. They promise it's not going to be a terribly long movie, but it's going to be just a great expression, and we can all sit there and nod and join in the discussion. But I'm so proud that this film was made by members of our congregation. That's on Thursday night, March 26th. At this time, the offering will be gratefully received, a chance to greet one another and bid each other a fine good morning. Our reading this morning, aside from revealing every minister's worst nightmare, the congregation can just get up and walk out of church. Wow. The reading showed that something that is so evident today, namely a distrust of idealism, even if it emanates from Jesus. Instead, we're convinced that we know how the real world works, and therefore we tend to dismiss ideal scenarios of a just and peaceful world as, simply impractical. It could never work because, we know how people really are. So after the minister in the story offers his own rebuttal to Jesus, he switches gears to challenge his congregation with the simple question, what if Jesus wasn't kidding? What if Jesus really meant to turn our lives around and for us to live in the manner he presented in his Sermon on the Mount? Now, members in the congregation had no problem expressing how they really felt about that idea. They either yelled at the minister and walked out, or they just walked out. The ideas posed by the minister's suggestion that there might actually be a Christian roadmap for how we ought to live our lives rattled the sensibilities of all who thought they already were leading sensible lives and who wanted nothing more than to continue with their sensible lives, which fit seamlessly into the status quo as though it were tongue-and-groove craftsmanship. There's a joke in philosophy that goes like this. The first law of philosophy is that for every philosopher, there exists an equal and opposite philosopher. And the second law of philosophy is they are both wrong. In the debate generally between idealism and pragmatism, both come up a little short. Expressing the means by which we attain a just world seems impractical. Living only as practical people ignores the injustices of the world. Idealism, by definition, is a rigid belief system in which you live your life based upon a morality of how the world is supposed to be or as it should be. If we feel a bit tentative pursuing such a righteous vision, we then ask, does it really need to be so rigid? Well, yes. Ask Jesus how much he was willing to compromise. Or ask any idealist who has become a household name, although, this is so interesting, there has never been an ideal society established in this world. The world as it should be has never come to pass. So somehow idealism may have some problems. Pragmatism, by definition, means doing what is practical, regardless of what you think ought to be the right choice for how to live. But then we are left to wonder, how much is a pragmatist supposed to compromise while cutting away at this, cutting away at what is morally sound? You give up this and that, you snip a little here and a little there, and at the end, there's really not much left of any substance. So somehow pragmatism seems to have some problems too. In this election year, the stakes are really high. The incumbent president must be removed from office. Now, is that done by making a convincing case of how our nation should be and ought to be, thereby compelling voters to join in with this new vision? Or should we be pragmatic and try to sweep as many people as possible with diverse views into the same tent in order to rid our nation of its present White House occupant? Now, those who defend idealism contend that society is so unjust, it's now virtually an oligarchy, that we must alleviate the situation through radical change. And that vision of what society could be is so compelling that, enough voters will sign on to defeat the incumbent. And those who defend pragmatism contend this is no time to experiment with shaping a perfect world. The only objective at this time is to defeat the incumbent with as many voters as possible. this would entail not alienating anybody. There's nothing wrong in compromising as long as the current president is forced out. Which philosophy will prevail? And if the congregation in the story this morning had anything to say about it, they would opt for maintaining the status quo, thank you very much. They would have too much to lose otherwise than making the world more perfect for everybody else. But the minister expressing the ideal views of Jesus seemed pretty persuasive. But do enough people have the courage and discipline to make those personal sacrifices for the sake of a just world? An idealist, by definition, is an extremist. We saw that in the Democratic debates. The idealist or extremist is likely to make decisions with the longer term in mind, implementing change to counter climate catastrophe, begin universal health care, end college debt, reduce the wealth gap, mend the safety net. All this is not going to happen on day one of the presidency. The extremist will fight for the best moral solution based on his or her understanding of an ideal world, regardless how long it takes, and even if it's unlikely to ever be achievable. The idealist presents an all-or-nothing approach and will not bend to the will of the status quo. The pragmatist, on the other hand, will focus on short-term solutions. He or she is willing to accommodate all sorts of ideas and keep all options open. Now, rather than stand up to the status quo, the pragmatist is most likely to want to get along with most everyone. I mean, that's how you get things done. Which philosophy is the best bet to defeat the incumbent? We don't really know, do we? I mean, compromising is not inherently bad, but are we willing to compromise on climate change? I mean, isn't the Green New Deal the only solution, however extreme it may be? Now, the difference between idealists of 2,000 years ago and the idealists today is that we're literally running out of time to make the world habitable to humanity and all species. This small speck we occupy in the cosmos may be gone in a heartbeat if we don't change our way of life dramatically right now. But let's be practical. The Green New Deal can scare away a lot of voters needed to defeat the president. If he's not defeated, well, we're worse off. Let's be assured of getting the votes needed, even if we have to put the environment on hold for a little. What? We're going to run out of time then, the idealist insists. We need to make changes now or everything just goes down the tubes. And the pragmatist counters, well, this is not the time for an all-or-nothing campaign. All we want is to get the president out of office. Democrats have never really had to deal with extremist candidates in the past. Obama was a centrist, as was Clinton. LBJ and FDR had some leftist programs like the New Deal, the Fair Deal, Social Security, the Great Society, and so on. But these were actually more stopgap measures with a return to capitalism guaranteed. These programs were hardly what is referred to these days as a revolution. One viable candidate today is calling for a complete transformation of society. Now, many of us believe his vision is long overdue, but at the same time, isn't it a gamble because of the uncertainty of enough people signing on to such a radical transformation? The word, just the word revolution, can alienate so many voters. The downside to idealism is sacrifice. Those who more or less live comfortably will have to let go of some of their so-called luxuries that make their lives easy. Indeed, materialistic comforts will be lost in the transformation of society in order to include the people who right now are living on the margins and those who have no health care, poor education, and not really a sliver of a chance to tap into the wealth of opportunities our society could and should make available to everyone. The idealist is willing to give up comfort in order to do what is morally right, at least what is perceived as right in his or her own estimation. Now, according to the media, the locus of where the philosophical differences mostly play out between idealism and pragmatism is found in the American suburbs, mostly among women. They tend to be college educated, and their anxiety over guns and school safety and pre-existing conditions in healthcare and the degradation of the environment helped deliver a House majority for Democrats in 2018. They represent a critical bloc for a Democratic victory in this election. They claim to be progressive, but don't want a revolution, we are told. Privately, I wonder, where do you draw the line between progressivism and revolution? Can one be progressive? Yeah, but, well, progressive just up to a certain point. Can you believe, it's good to be a progressive, but too much of it can bring on that unwanted revolution. Where's the line? At what point does progressivism stop being a virtue and turns nasty or threatening? Is it when we personally then feel the effects of change and must make sacrifices that compromise our wealth? Are liberals then, if you listen to these liberal progressive types, are they just demanding, when you come right down to it, are they just asking for a little bit of justice? Are they just asking for, a few green policies as long as we keep our lifestyles intact? Well, frankly, the issue is not exclusively the province of suburban women, aka soccer moms, from a few elections ago. All of us must weigh in, at this election especially, weigh in on the extent to which we are willing to sacrifice for the transformation of our society. And at the same time, figure out if it's a gamble worth pursuing. American democracy faces its biggest challenge in its entire history. Civil liberties, civil rights, human rights are fast eroding before our eyes. So do we want to forfeit the ideal in order to ensure that the right-wing takeover of our nation will be stopped? Or do we go for broke, all or nothing, transforming our nation to a new level of justice? But then again, can we ever agree on how much we need to personally sacrifice for this dream to come true? Can we even ever agree on what that dream is? Kim Domenico, an exciting writer for a magazine called Counterpunch, upholds the philosophy of idealism. She challenges liberals, including herself. In fact, if she were standing in this pulpit right now, she would say, you may want to label yourself liberal and progressive, but have you ever demanded real change? A good question. Have you ever demanded real change? What would that look like? And she doesn't stop there. She adds, we seem quite attached to our privileged home and therefore cannot possibly extricate ourselves from our capitalistic society that values profits over people, machines over human beings. We liberals are part of the problem, and that we are part of a society that has lost its human bearings. She puts it out there without apology. We liberals accept a way of life that is blasphemous to the ecological well-being of this earth. She says, it's truly puzzling that while our world is faced with the truly unthinkable worst, mass extinction, nuclear war, fascism, the liberal establishment had their eyes glued to the impeachment proceedings or the trial of Harvey Weinstein getting his just desserts. MSNBC is apparently the liberals' trusted friend. Its smoothly coiffed and tanned talking heads chatting confidently away while the unthinkable rolls inexorably on. Few middle-class liberals are awake enough to see the need to commit themselves, she says, to a social and cultural renewal. Note, she does not say revolution. Social and cultural renewal, a renewal of human supporting conditions and values. Domenico confirms that an idealist is an extremist who is about all or nothing. There's not a hint of her willing to be a little more pragmatic to attract a wider following. Instead, she says, our situation is so dire right now that even the middle class, with so much comfort to lose, will awaken to overturn the status quo. She says, it's just a few seconds before midnight, so we can arise from our slumber. If we don't, we're sunk. Again, all or nothing. At the back of our minds, or at least in the back of my mind, is the realization that an ideal society has never come to pass. Can the Jesus ideas of a just society actually be imposed on our country at this time? When I was still in seminary, the Christian Marxist dialogue was a hot item. Marxism and Christianity were not antithetical as was once believed. Jesus' revolution was every bit as radical as what the Marxists had in mind. But the world, it seems, was always in this desperate need of a revolution. But humanity never went there. Humanity just couldn't really handle that. Now, I lean more towards a question that was framed in Terry Tempest Williams' latest book, Erosion. It recounts a conversation that she had with an activist from South Africa who went to jail for his protest against apartheid. And he said to her, You Americans, you've mastered the art of living with the unacceptable. And Terry wrote that she wondered ever since, what was unacceptable? She immediately thought of wilderness being sold for $8 an acre to be used for extracting fossil fuel. But you know, that question makes you wonder more widely about our own threshold for what is unacceptable. Working families who are homeless, brown children separated from their families and put into cages, unarmed African American youth shot to death by police with impunity, the melting of Antarctica, children slain in school by mass murderers with easy access to assault weapons. My God, there's so much that is simply unacceptable. Have we mastered the art of simply living with all of this? Doesn't this need to change for our own salvation? But how do we vote? For idealism, knowing the number willing to make the sacrifice is iffy. For pragmatism, which brings in more people, but may make too many compromises for the good of the nation. Well, maybe the answer is obvious to you. It's not so obvious to me. Again, the first law of philosophy is that for every philosopher there exists an equal and opposite philosopher. And the second law of philosophy is that they're both wrong. So they're both wrong. Right now, I'm just grateful that not too many of you walked up and out of the sermon this morning. But you know, basically, maybe it is always the same sermon, every time, everywhere, throughout time. Idealism on the one side, pragmatism on the other. In an election as important as this one, coming right up, we will have to choose. We will have to choose. So be it. Can we conclude our service? Turning our hymn books, please. The first three verses, hymn number 298. As we extinguish the chalice, may we close with these words by St. Francis of Assisi, whose sentiments apply really throughout all of history. It's an admonition to all of us, regardless in which era we find ourselves. It goes like this: where hate rules, let us bring love. Where sorrow, joy. Let us strive more to comfort others than to be comforted, to understand others than to be understood, to love others more than to be loved. For it is in giving that we receive, and in pardoning that we are pardoned. Amen. David, thank you for that musical punctuation mark. That's what we needed. Let's break for coffee and conversation.